Book 5, Part 1 of The Art of War by Niccolo Machiavelli, translated by Henry Neville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 5, Part 1. Fabrizio said, "I have shown you how to organize an army to battle another army which is seen posted against you, and I have told you how it is overcome, and also of the many circumstances which can occur because of the various incidents surrounding it, so that it appears to me now to be the time to show you how to organize an army against an enemy which is unseen, but which you are continually afraid will assault you. This happens when marching through country which is hostile, or suspected of being so. And first you have to understand that a Roman army ordinarily always sent ahead some groups of cavalry as observers for the march. Afterwards the right wing followed. After this came all the wagons which pertained to it. After those another legion, and next its wagons. After these come the left wing with its wagons in the rear, and the remainder of the cavalry followed in the last part. This was, in effect, the manner in which one ordinarily marched, and if it happened that the army should be assaulted on the march, in front or from the rear, they quickly caused all the wagons to be withdrawn either on the right or on the left, according as it happened, or rather as best they could, depending on the location, and all the forces together, free from their baggage, set up a front on that side from which the enemy was coming. If they were assaulted on the flank, they would withdraw the wagons to the side which was secure, and set up a front on the other. This method being good, and prudently conducted, appears to me ought to be imitated, sending cavalry ahead to observe the country, then having 4 battalions, having the march in line, and each with its wagons in the rear. And as the wagons are of 2 kinds, that is, those pertaining to individual soldiers, and the public ones for use by the whole camp, I would divide the public wagons into 4 parts, and assign a part to each battalion, also dividing the artillery and all the unarmed men, so that each one of those armed should have its equal share of the impedimenta. But as it sometimes happens that one marches in a country not only suspect, but hostile in fact, that you are afraid of being attacked hourly, in order to go more securely, you are compelled to change the formation of the march, and go on in the regular way, so that in some unforeseen place neither the inhabitants nor the army can injure you. In such a case, the ancient captains usually went on with the army in squares, for such they called these formations, not because it was entirely square, but because it was capable of fighting on 4 sides, and they said they were going prepared either for marching or for battle. I do not want to stray far from this method, and want to arrange my 2 battalions, which I have taken as a rule for an army, in this manner. If you want, therefore, to walk securely through the enemy country, and be able to respond from every side, if you had been assaulted by surprise and wanting in accordance with the ancients to bring it into a square, I would plan to make a square whose hollow was 200 arm lengths on every side, in this manner. I would first place the flanks, each distant from the other by 212 arm lengths, and would place 5 companies in each flank, in a file along its length, and distant from each other 3 arm lengths. These would occupy their own space, each company occupying a space 40 arm lengths by 212 arm lengths. Between the front and rear of these 2 flanks, I would place another 10 companies, 5 on each side, arranging them in such a way that 4 should be next to the front of the right flank, and 5 at the rear of the left flank, leaving between each one an interval or gap of 4 arm lengths, one of which should be next to the front of the left flank, and one at the rear of the right flank. And as the space existing between the one flank and the other is 212 arm lengths, and these companies placed alongside each other by their width and not length, they would come to occupy, with the intervals, 134 arm lengths, and there would be between the 4 companies placed on the front of the right flank and one placed on the left, a remaining space of 78 arm lengths, and a similar space be left among the companies placed in the rear parts. And there would be no other difference except that one space would be on the rear side towards the right wing, the other would be on the front side towards the left wing. In the space of 78 arm lengths, in front I would place all the ordinary veleti, and that in the rear the extraordinary veleti, who would come to be 1,000 per space. And if you want that the space taken up by the army should be 212 arm lengths on every side, I would see that 5 companies are placed in front, and those that are placed in the rear should not occupy any space already occupied by the flanks, and therefore I would see that the 5 companies in the rear should have their front touch the rear of their flanks, and those in the front should have their rear touch the front of their flanks, so that on every side of the army space would remain to receive another company. And as there are 4 spaces, I would take 4 banners away from the extraordinary pikemen, and would put one on every corner. And the 2 banners of the aforementioned pikemen left to me I would place in the middle of the hollow of their army, formed in a square of companies, at the heads of which the general captain would remain with his men around him. And as these companies so arranged all march in one direction, but not all fight in one, in putting them together one has to arrange which sides are not guarded by other companies during the battle. And therefore it ought to be considered that the 5 companies in front protect all the other sides except the front, and therefore these have to be assembled in an orderly manner, and with the pikemen in front. The 5 companies behind protect all the sides except the side in the back, and therefore ought to be assembled so that the pikemen are in the rear, as we will demonstrate in its place. The 5 companies on the right flank protect all the sides from the right flank outward. The 5 on the left engird all the sides from the left flank outward. And therefore, in arranging the companies, the pikemen ought to be placed so that they turn by that flank which is uncovered. And as the heads of 10 are placed in the front and rear, so that when they have to fight, all the army and its members are in their proper places, the manner of accomplishing this was told when we discussed the methods of arranging the companies. I would divide the artillery, and one part I would place outside the right flank, and the other at the left. I would send the light cavalry ahead to reconnoitre the country. Of the men-at-arms, I would place part in the rear on the right wing, and part on the left, distant 40 arm lengths from the companies. And no matter how you arrange your army, you have to take up as the cavalry this general rule, that you have to place them always either in the rear or on the flanks. Whoever places them ahead in front of the army must do one of 2 things. Either he places them so far ahead that if they are repulsed, they have so much room to give them time to be able to obtain shelter for themselves from your infantry and not collide with them, or to range them, the infantry, with so many intervals that by means of them the cavalry can enter among them without disorganizing them. Let not anyone think little of this instruction, because many, not being aware of this, have been ruined and have been disorganized and routed by themselves. The wagons and the unarmed men are placed in the plaza that exists within the army, and so compartmented that they easily make way for whoever wants to go from one side to the other, or from one front of the army to the other. These companies, without artillery and cavalry, occupy 280 arm lengths of space on the outside in every direction, and as this square is composed of 2 battalions, it must be devised as to which part one battalion makes up, and which part the other. And since the battalions are called by number, and each of them has, as you know, 10 companies and a general head, I would have the 1st battalion place its first 5 companies in the front, and the other 5 on the left flank, and the head should be in the left angle of the front. The first 5 companies of the 2nd battalion then should be placed on the right flank, and the other 5 in the rear, and the head should be in the right angle, who would undertake the office of tergidatore. The army, organized in this manner, is ready to move, and in its movement should completely observe this arrangement, and without doubt it is secure from all the tumults of the inhabitants. Nor ought the captain make other provisions against these tumultuous assaults than sometimes to give a commission to some cavalry or band of veliti to put them in their place. Nor will it ever happen that these tumultuous people will come to meet you with the drawing of sword or pike, because disorderly people are afraid of order. And it will always be seen that they make a great assault with shouts and noises without otherwise approaching you, in the way of yelping dogs around a mastiff. Hannibal, when he came to harm from the Romans in Italy, passed through all of France, and always took little account of the tumults of the French. When you want to march, you must have levellers and men with pickaxes ahead, who clear the road for you, and who are well protected by that cavalry sent ahead to reconnoitre. An army will march in this order 10 miles a day, and enough sun and light will remain for them to dine and camp, since ordinarily an army marches 20 miles. If it happens that it is assaulted by an organised army, this assault cannot arise suddenly, because an organised army travels at its own rate, so that you are always in time to reorganize for the engagement, and quickly bring yourself to that formation, or similar to that formation, of the army which I showed you above. For if you are assaulted on the front side, you do nothing except to have the artillery in the flanks and the cavalry behind come forward and take those places and with those distances mentioned above. The 1,000 veliti who are forward come forth from their positions, and dividing into groups of 100, enter into their places between the cavalry and the wings of the army. Then, into the voids left by them, enter the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen, which I had placed in the plaza of the army. The 1,000 veliti that I had placed in the rear depart from there, and distribute themselves among the flanks of the companies to strengthen them, and from the open space they leave, all the wagons and unarmed men issue forth, and place themselves in the rear of the companies. The plaza, therefore, remains vacant, as everyone has gone to their places, and the 5 companies that I placed in the rear of the army come forward through the open void that exists between the one and the other flank, and march toward the company in the front, and the 3 approach them at 40 arm lengths, with equal intervals between one another, and 2 remain behind, distant another 40 arm lengths. This formation can be organized quickly, and comes to be almost the same as the first disposition of the army which we described before. And if it becomes more straightened at the front, it becomes larger in the flanks, which does not weaken it. But as the 5 companies in the back have their pikemen in the rear for the reasons mentioned above, it is necessary to have them come from the forward part, if you want them to get behind the front of the army. And therefore one must either make them turn company by company as a solid body, or make them enter quickly between the ranks of the shield-bearers or swordsmen, and bring them forward, which method is more swift and less disorderly than to make them turn. And thus you ought to do with all those who are in the rear in every kind of assault, as I will show you. If it should happen that the enemy comes from the rear, the first thing that ought to be done is to have everyone turn to face the enemy, so that at once the front of the army becomes the rear, and the rear the front. Then all those methods of organizing the front should be followed, which I mentioned above. If the enemy attacks on the right flank, the entire army ought to be made to face in that direction, and then those things ought to be done to strengthen that new front which were mentioned above, so that the cavalry, the veliti, and the artillery are in the position assigned in this front. There is only this difference, that in the changing of fronts, of those who move about, some have to go further and some less. It is indeed true that when a front is made on the right flank, the veliti would have to enter the intervals or gaps that exist between the wings of the army, and the cavalry would be those nearer to the left flank, in the position of those who would have to enter into the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen placed in the centre. But before they enter, the wagons and unarmed men stationed at the openings should clear the plaza and retire behind the left flank, which then becomes the rear of the army. And the other veliti, who should be placed in the rear according to the original arrangement, in this case should not be changed, as that place should not remain open, which from being the rear would become a flank. All the other things ought to be done as was said concerning the first front. What has been said concerning making a front from the right flank is intended also in making one from the left flank, since the same arrangements ought to be observed. If the enemy should happen to be large and organized to assault you on two sides, the two sides on which he assaults you ought to be strengthened from the two that are not assaulted, doubling the ranks in each one, and distributing the artillery, veleti, and cavalry among each side. If he comes from 3 or 4 sides, it needs must be either you or he lacks prudence. For if you were wise, you would never put yourself on the side where the enemy could assault you from 3 or 4 sides with large and organized forces. And if he wanted to attack you in safety, he must be so large and assault you on each side with a force almost as large as you have in your entire army. And if you are so little prudent that you put yourself in the midst of the territory and forces of an enemy who has 3 times the organized forces that you have, you cannot complain if evil happens to you, except of yourself. If it happens not by your fault, but by some misadventure, the injury will be without shame, and it will happen to you as it did to the Scipios in Spain and the Hasdrubal in Italy. But if the enemy has a much larger force than you, and in order to disorganize you wants to assault you on several sides, it will be his foolishness and his gamble. For to do this, he must spread himself thin, that you can always attack on one side and resist on another, and in a brief time ruin him. This method of organizing an army, which is not seen but who is feared, is necessary, and it is a most useful thing to accustom your soldiers to assemble and march in such order, and in marching arrange themselves to fight according to the first front planned, and then return to marching formation. From that make a front from the rear, and then from the flank, and from that return to the original formation. These exercises and accustomization are necessary matters if you want a disciplined and trained army. Captains and princes have to work hard at these things, nor is military discipline anything else than to know how to command and how to execute these things. Nor is a disciplined army anything else than an army which is well trained in these arrangements. Nor would it be possible for anyone in these times who should well employ such discipline ever to be routed. And if this square formation which I have described is somewhat difficult, such difficulty is necessary if you take it up as an exercise, since, knowing how to organize and maintain oneself well in this, one would afterwards know how to manage more easily those which will not be as difficult. End of Book 5, Part 1.